From shoveling snow up against the outside walls of the house on purpose to sleeping on a shelf built into the side of a brick oven, our great-grandparents got through winters that would break most modern households, and they did it without a furnace, without insulation, and without a thermostat anywhere in the building. We heat differently now. We take a whole house, every hallway, every closet, every empty guest room, and we hold all of that air at a fixed temperature around the clock, then send fuel up a flue and heat out through the walls all winter long. They never tried to do that. They heated the person, not the property. And once you see how they did it, some of what we do starts to look genuinely ridiculous. These are 25 old winter tricks that worked. Number 1. Banking the house with snow. The first heavy snow was not a problem to be cleared. It was a delivery of building material. Families across the northern plains and up into Canada shoveled snow up against the outside walls of the house, packing it in a heavy bank all the way around the foundation and sometimes halfway up the siding. It looks like the worst possible idea, burying your home in the very thing you are trying to escape. Snow is mostly air. Loose snow is somewhere around 9/10 air by volume, trapped in millions of tiny pockets, and trapped air is exactly what every insulating material in your walls right now is trying to hold on to. A thick snowbank stops the wind from stripping heat off the boards, and it keeps the crawl space and the floor from freezing. The same principle is why an igloo works, and why a person caught out in the open is far better off digging into a drift than sitting on top of one. Nobody banks a house anymore. The snow gets blown away from the foundation with a machine, which is the exact opposite of what it was for. Number 2, banking with earth, leaves, and manure. Where the snow was unreliable, families made their own bank, and the fall chore of banking up the house was as regular as putting in firewood. Dry leaves were raked into a deep pile around the base of the walls and held in place with boards, brush, or corn stalks stood up in a row. In farming country, fresh manure went into the bank as well, because manure does something leaves do not. As it breaks down, it generates real heat of its own, quietly warming the ground and the sill of the house for weeks. Along the coast of New England, families used seaweed hauled up off the beach, packed into the walls and around the foundation, and restorers pulling apart old houses on Cape Cod still find it in there. Every one of those materials was free, local, and available in enormous quantity. In the spring, the leaves and manure went straight on to the garden. The house got insulated, and then the insulation grew the vegetables. Number 3, living in the ground. On the treeless plains there was nothing to build with, so families built out of the plains themselves. A special plow cut the tough prairie sod into long ribbons, which were chopped into bricks and stacked grass side down, layer upon layer, into walls that ran 2 and even 3 feet thick. The result was a soddy, and from outside it looked like a low green hump in a field of grass. Others simply cut into the side of a hill and roofed the front, which is a dugout. Those walls did something no modern frame wall can. Thick earth holds temperature, so a soddy stayed above freezing in a blizzard and cool through a July heat wave, using almost no fuel to do it. On a prairie where the only firewood came from twisted grass and dried buffalo chips, that mattered more than anything. The downsides were real. They leaked mud when it rained, snakes came through the roof, and nobody kept one longer than they had to. But for pure heating performance, a sod house beats a modern uninsulated frame house without breathing hard. Number 4, putting the house in the right spot. Before anybody cut a single board, they stood on the land and looked at it, and where they put the house did more for winter comfort than any stove ever would. You built into the south-facing slope of a hill, so the ground rose up behind the north wall and shielded it. You put the back of the house to the prevailing winter wind. You kept the windows on the south side where the low winter sun could come in and land on the floor all day, and you kept them small on the north. Then you planted. Rows of trees went in on the north and west sides as a windbreak, and a well-grown shelter belt cuts the wind speed on the far side of it for a distance many times the height of the trees. On the plains, the federal government eventually encouraged tree planting outright, because everyone understood that trees were the difference between a survivable homestead and an unbearable one. Today, houses go up facing whatever direction the road happens to run, and then a furnace is installed to fight the consequences for the next 100 years. Number 5, shutting up the house. This is the single biggest difference between how they lived and how we live, and it is the one that makes modern heating look most absurd. They did not heat the house, they heated a room. In late autumn, the parlor got closed. The good room, the one with the nice furniture that visitors saw, was shut up in November and not opened again until the weather turned. Upstairs, bedrooms went unheated all winter, as a matter of course. Spare rooms were shut. Doors stayed closed, and there was usually one heavy door or a hung quilt separating the warm part of the house from the cold part. The whole family then lived in the kitchen. That was where the fire was, where the food was, where the sewing and the schoolwork and the conversation happened, and where everybody sat in the evening. The kitchen was genuinely warm. The rest of the house was cold enough that a glass of water might skin over with ice by morning, and nobody considered that a failure. They considered it the winter. Number 6, the cold trap at the door. Every time a door opens in winter, the house loses a room's worth of warm air and takes in a room's worth of freezing air. Old buildings were designed specifically around that fact. The answer was to never let the outside touch the inside directly. Farmhouses had a storm porch, a mudroom, an enclosed entry, a summer kitchen, or in the north a whole chain of connected buildings running from the house out to the barn, so a person could get to the animals in a blizzard without ever stepping into the open. The rule was simple: 2 doors, and never both open at once. The little room in between takes the shock. Grand buildings did the same thing with a vestibule, and the reason a fancy hotel still has a revolving door is precisely this: a door that lets a person through while never actually connecting the lobby to the street. A modern house very often has one door from the porch straight into the living room, and every visitor drops the temperature of the entire floor. Number 7, chinking, stuffing, and the winter window. Autumn on the homestead meant going around the building and hunting for daylight. Cabin walls got chinked, with mud, clay, moss, straw, animal hair, and lime worked into every gap between the logs, and it was redone every year because the logs kept moving. Rags and paper were stuffed into cracks around window frames. Sacking was nailed over gaps in the floorboards. Before glass was affordable, windows were paper-soaked in grease or oil, which lets in a dull light and stops the wind, and a family would take those out in the spring and put them back in the fall. Once glass arrived, they added a second layer, the storm sash, hung on the outside of the window every autumn and taken down in spring and stored in the barn. 2 panes with an air gap between them is the entire principle behind every double-glazed window sold today, and it was being done with a screwdriver and a ladder more than a century ago. Draft sealing is boring. It is also the highest return work anybody has ever done on a cold house, then or now. Number 8, newspaper in the walls. Take apart an old farmhouse and you will find the strangest insulation collection imaginable. Newspapers stuffed into the stud cavities, sometimes layered thick, sometimes pasted right onto the boards as wallpaper backing. Corn cobs packed into wall spaces, sawdust and wood shavings from the mill poured in from above. Seaweed, straw, old rags, horsehair mixed into the plaster. They had no fiberglass and no foam, but they understood the principle exactly. Anything that traps still air and stays dry will slow heat down. Restoration crews find those newspapers all the time, and they are a small-time capsule, because the date on the page tells you the year that wall was closed up. Some of it worked well, Some of it settled to the bottom of the cavity within a decade, or gave mice the best home in the county. But a wall stuffed with newspaper beats an empty wall by a wide margin, and an empty wall is what most 19th century houses started out with. Number 9. Quilts on the doors and cloth on the walls. Textiles were treated as building material, not decoration. A heavy quilt or a folded blanket was hung over the inside of an outside door on a rod, so it fell across the whole opening and cut the draft that came under and around it. Curtains over doorways, called portières, closed off a warm room from a cold hallway. Long, heavy drapes on the windows were drawn at dusk, and there is real measurable value in that, because a window is by far the coldest surface in any room. Wall hangings and tapestries in older European homes were doing the same work, cutting the chill radiating off a cold stone wall. Rugs went on the floor for the same reason, since a cold floor pulls heat out of your feet faster than cold air pulls it off your face. This is the one on the entire list that anybody can copy this week for almost no money. Heavy curtains, closed at dusk, and something across the bottom of every door. Number 10. The bed in a cupboard. In Scotland, in Brittany, in the Netherlands, and in plenty of American cabins with a Northern European family in them, the bed was not a piece of furniture standing in a room. It was a wooden box built into the wall with doors on the front. You climbed in and closed the doors behind you. What that gives you is a tiny, sealed room the size of a bed, warmed to body temperature within a few minutes, and held there all night by nothing but the people inside it. No draft can reach you. The heat has nowhere to escape to. Children slept 2 and 3 to a box bed and stayed warm in a house where the water bucket froze solid 10 feet away. Sometimes the box was built into the wall right behind the fireplace, so it borrowed the warmth of the chimney stack all night. We now heat the entire volume of a bedroom all night long so that one person lying under a blanket does not get cold. The box bed heated the blanket. Number 11. Bed curtains and the nightcap. For anybody without a box bed, the four-poster did the same job with fabric. Those heavy curtains hanging from the frame of an old bed were never for privacy or for looks. They were pulled shut. A closed set of bed curtains turns an open bed into a fabric tent that holds your own body heat around you, and in a room with no heat at all, that is the difference between sleeping and shivering until dawn. Which brings us to the nightcap, the thing everybody has seen in old illustrations and assumed was a joke. It was not a joke. A bare head in a freezing bedroom sheds a serious amount of heat, straight up into a cold ceiling. A cap tied under the chin stops that, and everybody wore one, men, women, and children. Sleeping in a hat sounds ridiculous in a house held at a steady temperature by a machine. In a bedroom that dropped near freezing every single night, it was ordinary common sense. Number 12. Sleeping inside the bed instead of on it. An old bed was built up in layers, and the layers were doing serious work. At the bottom, ropes or boards, then a straw tick, a big sack stuffed with fresh straw or corn husks, replaced every year, which provides bulk and lift and traps air underneath you. On top of that, if the family could afford it, a feather tick. And here is the part that surprises people. The feather bed frequently went on top of the sleeper, not underneath. You climbed in between the ticks and had a great mound of feathers over you, and you sank down into the whole arrangement until only your face was showing. Insulation underneath a sleeper matters just as much as insulation above, because a body loses heat straight down into whatever it is lying on. That is the same lesson every camper eventually learns the hard way about a sleeping pad. Modern beds are built to look flat and tidy. An old bed was built to swallow you. Number 13. The stove you sleep on. Now the best one, and the reason so much of modern heating looks foolish by comparison. Across Russia, Scandinavia, Germany, and the Alps, families did not build metal stoves. They built enormous ones out of masonry, brick, and tile, sometimes taking up a large share of a room and running from floor to ceiling. They are not fired continuously. You burn a hot, fast, clean fire in the firebox for an hour or two, and the smoke then travels through a long, twisting channel of masonry before it reaches the chimney, dumping nearly all its heat into that mass on the way. Then you shut it down and walk away. That mass gives the heat back slowly and gently for the next 12 to 24 hours. Gentle even, radiant warmth off a warm wall, with no roaring, no cycling on and off, and no blast of dry air. And in a Russian house, the top of the stove was flat, wide, and warm, so the oldest and the youngest members of the family slept up there. A shelf on the side of the oven was the best place in the house on a January night, and everybody knew it. 1 fire a day, warm for 24 hours. That design is centuries old, and it still outperforms most of what gets installed now. Number 14, banking the fire. Matches were not always cheap or reliable, and starting a fire from nothing on a black, freezing morning was miserable work. So nobody let the fire go out. Ever. The last thing done at night was banking. The remaining coals were raked into a tight heap at the back of the hearth and then buried under a thick blanket of their own ash. Ash is a fine insulator, and it chokes the airflow down to almost nothing, so the coals cannot burn up but cannot die either. They sit and smolder in the dark for 8 or 10 hours. In the morning, the ash was pulled back. A bit of kindling went on the live coals, a few breaths of air, and the fire was up again in a couple of minutes. This was so central to daily life that it left a word behind in English. In medieval Europe, a bell rang in the evening to tell everyone to cover their fires for the night, and the French phrase for covering the fire came into English as curfew. Keeping the household fire alive was a real responsibility, usually a woman's, and letting it go out overnight was a genuine failure that the whole family felt in the morning. If this is bringing back something from your own family, put it in the comments, because that is where the best details come from. And hit subscribe while you are down there. We do this every week. Now, the next 10 are the tricks for heating a body rather than a building, and one of them was carried into church every Sunday for 200 years. Number 15. The fireback and the reflector. An open fireplace is a wonderful thing to sit in front of and a terrible way to heat a room. Most of the heat goes straight up the chimney, and the fire even pulls cold air in through every crack in the house to feed itself. So they fought back with iron. A fireback is a thick, decorated cast iron plate that stands against the back wall of the fireplace. It protects the masonry, and more importantly, it soaks up heat and throws it back out into the room, and it keeps radiating long after the fire has died down. The same thinking gave us the tin reflector oven, a bright angled box set on the hearth in front of the fire that bounces heat onto a roast or a pan of biscuits from several directions at once. Benjamin Franklin took the idea further and put an iron box out into the room so the whole thing could radiate on all sides, which is the ancestor of every wood stove sold since. Get the heat off the bricks and out into the room where the people are. Simple, and it is still the whole argument for a stove over an open hearth. Number 16. The warming pan. That long-handled brass pan with the perforated lid hanging on the wall of every antique shop in the country was a working tool, and it had a technique. Live coals from the fire went into the pan, the lid was closed, and somebody carried it up to the freezing bedroom and slid it between the sheets. The key part is that it never stopped moving. You slid it back and forth continuously across the whole bed because leaving it in one place for more than a few seconds would scorch the linen or set it alight. A well-warmed bed is a completely different experience from a cold one. Getting into cold sheets means your body has to heat the entire bed with its own metabolism before you can sleep, and in a freezing room that can take a long, unpleasant while. The warming pan was the household job of a servant or the youngest child, and it was the last thing done before anybody went upstairs. An electric blanket does the same job on a timer. It just took an extra couple of centuries to arrive. Number 17. The hot soapstone, the finest personal heater ever invented, and it has no moving parts. Soapstone is a soft, dense rock that holds an enormous amount of heat and gives it back slowly and evenly, and it never gets so hot that it burns you through a cloth. Families kept flat slabs of it on the back of the stove all day, warming. At bedtime, a slab was wrapped in flannel and put down at the foot of the bed. In the morning, it was still warm. Going out in the sleigh, one went under the buffalo robe by everybody's feet, and it would stay warm for a long journey in bitter weather. Families without soapstone used a common brick heated in the oven, wrapped in newspaper, and then a towel, which does the same thing for free. You can buy soapstone bed warmers today, and they still work exactly as well as they did in 1880, because a rock has not changed. A modern household will heat an entire bedroom to warm a person's feet. A slab of stone weighing a few pounds would do it. Number 18. The foot stove in the pew. Here is a fact that surprises people about early American life. Churches and meeting houses were not heated at all. For generations, congregations sat through long services in buildings colder than the outdoors, because a stove in a house of worship was considered an unnecessary indulgence, and in some places a genuine moral argument broke out about installing one. So families brought their heat with them. The foot stove was a small pierced metal box in a wooden frame with a handle, filled with hot coals and ash from the home fire before setting out. Set it on the floor of the pew, put your feet on it, and drape your long skirts or your greatcoat over the whole arrangement so the warm air is trapped around your legs. Dogs came to church too, and it was understood that a dog lying across your feet was doing useful work. Heat the person, not the building. The entire principle of this list carried under one arm on a Sunday morning. Number 19. The hot water pig. Before rubber, before anybody had a bottle you could fill from a tap, there was stoneware. A bed warmer of the period was a fat glazed ceramic vessel, wide and rounded with a small stopper on top, and in Britain and Ireland it was called a pig, which nobody has ever fully explained. It was filled with boiling water, corked tight, wrapped in a cloth, and put in the bed. Ceramic holds heat well and gives it up slowly, so a full pig would still be pleasantly warm at dawn. They were also used to keep the cold off a sick person and put in with newborn animals in the barn. The rubber hot water bottle replaced them once rubber was available, and the general principle never changed. Water holds more heat for its weight than almost any other cheap substance, which is why it is still the working fluid in most heating systems in the world. An old pig turns up in antique shops, labeled as a jug. It was a heater, and quite a good one. Number 20. Sleeping with the animals. Every warm-blooded animal in the barn is a furnace running on hay. A cow gives off a substantial amount of heat around the clock, and several cows in a closed space will hold that space well above freezing through a hard night. Old European farmhouses were built with the animals at one end and the family at the other, under one roof, with the byre wall shared. The heat and the smell came through together, and nobody complained about either. In the American North, the connected farm ran house to shed to barn in a line, so the barn was buffering the whole building against the wind. In the cabins, the practical version was the dog. A dog in the bed on a bitter night is a source of real heat, and the Australian expression about a 3-dog night describes exactly how cold it was by how many animals you needed. Modern building codes have opinions about livestock in the house, and fair enough. But the physics never stopped being true. Number 21. The manure hotbed. This is the one that sounds like a joke, and is in fact a genuine piece of engineering. Gardeners dug a pit and filled it with a deep layer of fresh horse manure mixed with straw, then covered that with several inches of good soil and put a glazed frame on top. As the manure breaks down, the microbes generate serious heat, enough to hold the soil above the frame well into the warm range for weeks on end. Seeds were started in there in the depths of winter. Lettuce, radishes, and greens were grown in the snow. Great estates in Europe used enormous versions of this to force melons and pineapples in a climate that had no business producing either. The heat is completely free, and it is a byproduct of an animal you already own. When it burns out in spring, the whole thing is finished compost and goes straight onto the beds. People still do this, and modern versions run water pipes through a compost mound to heat a greenhouse or a barn. It works because rotting is warm, which is a fact nobody in a city ever thinks about. Number 22. Letting the ground do the work. Go down a few feet into the earth and the temperature stops caring what the weather is doing. It settles near the yearly average for wherever you are, and it stays there, cool in August, well above freezing in January. The whole root cellar tradition runs on that fact. A hole in the ground with a door on it will hold potatoes, apples, and carrots all winter without ever freezing them, in a region where an unheated shed would turn them to mush in one night. The same principle kept a dugout habitable, kept a sod house warm, and kept a cave cool. Modern building rediscovered this and gave it an expensive name. A ground source heat pump is a machine that reaches down into that same stable earth and borrows its temperature, and it is one of the most efficient ways to heat a building that anybody has ever devised. Our great-grandparents did the same thing with a shovel, a door, and no moving parts at all. Number 23, wool and knowing how to wear it. The clothing was not a fashion choice. It was equipment, and there were rules. Wool was the material, because wool keeps a surprising amount of its insulating value when it is damp, while cotton stops working entirely the moment it gets wet. Layers were worn loose, never tight, because it is the still air trapped between and inside the layers that insulates you, and a tight coat crushes that air out and cuts the circulation to your hands and feet at the same time. In the fur country, a man made a capote by cutting up a heavy trade blanket and sewing it into a hooded coat with a sash at the waist. On the plains, a buffalo robe was the finest winter garment on the continent, and there was nothing made in a factory that came close. The rule everyone knew was about sweat. Loosen up before you start working hard, slow down before you soak your shirt, because a wet shirt in a cold wind will kill you far faster than the cold alone. Cold and dry beats warm and wet. That was true then, and it is true on a ski hill today. Number 24. Dry grass in your boots. The last thing to freeze on a person is usually the thing that kills the day, and it is almost always the feet. Northern peoples solved this long ago with a material that costs nothing. Certain tough grasses were cut in summer, dried and softened by pounding, and then packed into boots and moccasins in loose handfuls around the foot. The grass traps air, so it insulates. It also absorbs sweat, which is the real enemy, and at the end of the day it comes out and gets hung by the fire to dry while a fresh handful goes in. The Sami of northern Scandinavia used a specific grass for this and treated it as a serious commodity. Native and Inuit peoples across North America did the same with what grew near them, and the trappers who lasted in the mountains learned it from them fast. Soft moccasins with grass inside beat stiff leather boots in deep cold every time, because a tight boot squeezes out the air and squeezes off the blood supply. A modern boot liner does the identical job with foam and costs a great deal more than a handful of hay. Number 25. Eating like the fire is inside you. The last trick was not in the house or on the body. It was on the plate. A person working outdoors in real cold burns through an enormous amount of fuel, far more than the same person in summer, partly for the work and partly because shivering and staying warm are themselves expensive. Winter cooking on a homestead reflected that with total honesty. Fatback, lard, butter, cream, suet puddings, fried everything, heavy breads, and a pot of something on the stove all day. Fat carries more than twice the energy of the same weight of anything else you can eat, which is why pemmican was built around it, why Arctic peoples eat the way they do, and why every winter cuisine on Earth is rich. Digesting food produces its own warmth as well, so a hot, substantial meal genuinely does warm a person from the inside for hours afterwards, which is not the case for a hot drink. And that is the whole philosophy in one plate. Do not just build a warmer box around a cold person. Keep the person themselves running hot, then wrap them properly, then shrink the space you are trying to heat down to the size of the room they are actually in. Line all 25 up, and the same idea keeps coming back. Shrink the space, trap the air, use mass to hold heat and give it back slowly, block the wind, heat the person, not the property. We went the other way completely. We heat every cubic foot of a building, day and night, whether anyone is standing in it or not, and then we are surprised by the bill in February. None of this means anybody should give up their furnace. Nobody who lived through those winters would have chosen them. Every one of these people would have taken central heating in a heartbeat, and plenty of them died of cold in houses they had prepared as well as they knew how. But they understood something we quietly forgot. Comfort is not a temperature on a wall. It is a warm object near a person in a small room out of the wind. So tell me in the comments, what did your family do? Somebody out there still remembers a soapstone at the foot of the bed or a quilt hung over the back door, and I want to read about it. Subscribe for more of the old ways, because next week we are looking at how frontier families found water in country that had none, and some of what they did would get you a fine today.